about putting something in our own, I don't know if it's in the something underneath, emergencies, and when we do a declaration that kind of outlines, even if it's just referring to the information at the state level that outlines extraordinary powers, I think that would be a good thing. End of my comments.
Councilmember Pereira?
I don't have any comments on the resolution. I support that. But I did have a comment about current actions. And so if it's something that the city is taking, so I'm willing to hold on those comments if we want to hold that for after discussing the resolution.
Okay, Vice Mayor Patino?
Yeah, I have no questions on the resolution. Thank you.
Mr. Mayor, may I make a motion?
Yes, go ahead and make a motion.
Okay, I will make a motion to adopt resolution number 190-65, a resolution of the City Council of the City of Arcata, confirming the existence of a local emergency and ratifying the City Manager, Director of Emergency Services proclamation of existence of a local emergency in response to the coronavirus COVID-19 dated March 21st, 2020.
Second.
Karen, do we have any comments from the public on this item that you could read?
Yeah, Danielle will read those comments. I don't think they're about the proclamation, actually, so, but I'll double check. Danielle, do we have any comments specific to the proclamation or just about the actions taken later?
We do. We have, for new business item A, for the resolution. This is for the resolution, correct?
Yeah, go ahead and read them.
Yes. We have some comments. The first comes from Jessica Smith. It reads, "My name is Jessica Smith. I am an Arcata resident, a board member with Affordable Homeless Housing Alternatives, AHHA, and the Executive Director for Humble Area Center for Harm Reduction, AHCHR. In response to COVID-19, AHHA recently sent a letter to Arcata City Council members, City Manager, and all other Humboldt County leaders requesting an emergency ordinance be passed that include the following 6 measures. 1, an immediate moratorium on rent increases, all evictions and foreclosures. The need to protect residents that live paycheck to paycheck from this economic fallout of the virus includes protecting them against facing price gouging, eviction, and homelessness. Eviction would only further spread this disease and make its containment harder because people would not have a home to care for the health, safety, and welfare of their families. 2, immediate end to displacing unhoused encampments. We must put an end to the enforcement/displacement actions against encampments of the unhoused during this crisis. People living outside should be given an opportunity to shelter in place or quarantine if necessary. 3, provide sanctioned camps with access to facilities. Not only should displacement cease, but camps should be created in a way that provide opportunities for basic hygiene. Hand washing stations, bathrooms, and trash disposal would allow unhoused people to more safely and hygienically self-isolate and reduce the rate of other common ailments that overburdened healthcare systems will be less likely to address. 4, suspension of book and release protocols by law enforcement. Minor infractions and warrants for things like failure to appear should not be cause for arrest during this pandemic. Booking and releasing increases opportunities for spreading the virus and impacting the entire jail, which already has limited resources for addressing the virus should an outbreak happen internally. 5, emergency rental or mortgage assistance. We must provide for workers who have to forego work for no fault of their own due to the coronavirus outbreak. This also encourages workers to stay home when sick rather than risking spread of the virus by continuing to work to prevent income loss. 6, prevent utility shutoffs. Widespread loss of income will also likely cause increased numbers of people to fall behind on bills and risk having their water, gas, electricity, and other basic utility services shut off. All public and private utilities doing business in the state should halt all utility shutoffs during this crisis. As a member of AHHA and director of HACHR, I understand the pressing need to provide security and safety for our community members experiencing homelessness and housing insecurity. We appreciate the steps you have already taken to protect our community and ask that you continue to support the health and well-being of all residents by passing this emergency ordinance. The next comment comes from Jenna Bader. It reads, "Hello, my name is Jenna Bader. I am a board member of Affordable Homeless Housing Alternatives. I really appreciate what your office is doing to reduce the spread of COVID-19 for our housed community. I urge you to take immediate action to support our unhoused community at this time. You received a letter from us last Friday where we identified 6 urgent requests for an emergency ordinance. I understand that some of those items are being considered on the agenda tonight, so I would like to discuss the need for items 2 and 3 specifically, which call for an immediate end to displacing unhoused encampments and the creation of sanctioned camps with access to facilities. While the rest of the city is sheltering in place, remember that as of January 2019 point-in-time count, over 263 people in Arcata are unsheltered. Shelters are limiting beds to any new people at this time instead of opening them up to provide more services. Businesses that once provided restrooms for those living outside are now closed. These businesses provide water, restroom facilities, and momentary respite from the outdoors. The city must provide access to restroom and hygiene facilities now that these small businesses are not able to. Either meet people where they are by bringing facilities to them and allowing them to shelter in place, or provide a sanctioned camp with facilities available. The solution will legally allow our unhoused a place to stay, sheltered in place, have 6 feet of distance from each other, and access to the most basic human needs of a restroom, hand washing station, trash facilities, and most importantly, a safe, warm, and dry place to be while we all work through this health emergency together. If COVID-19 breaks out in this population, it will overwhelm our healthcare system, as so many are already struggling with underlying health conditions that make them even more vulnerable. Please consider an emergency ordinance following our 6 priorities and don't leave out our most vulnerable population that desperately need your help. AHHA also has a proposal for an outdoor living center that would provide an immediate solution for up to 30 people and want to work with you to implement it. Thank you." And the final comment on this topic comes from Winchell Dillenbeck. It reads, "My name is Winchell Dillenbeck. I am a board member of Affordable Homeless Housing Alternatives. I appreciate your efforts to reduce the spread of COVID-19. AHA recently sent a letter to the Arcata City Council members requesting an emergency ordinance be passed. These 3 measures deal with the prevention of creating more unhoused individuals and families. They include an immediate moratorium on rent increases, all evictions and foreclosures, emergency rental or mortgage assistance, prevent utility shutoffs. The second 3 measures deal with stopping the spread of COVID-19 among the homeless that could spread into the broader population. Immediate end to displacing unhoused encampments, provide sanctioned camps with access to facilities, suspension of book and release protocols. Shelters are now locked down and the options for the unhoused are very limited. Restrooms, hygiene stations, and garbage facilities are extremely limited. If COVID-19 breaks out in this population, it could spread to the general public and overwhelm the healthcare system. While I appreciate the steps you have taken to provide the security and safety for our community members experiencing homelessness, I urge you to support our most vulnerable population and pass this emergency ordinance. Thank you." That's the end of the public comment on this item.
Karen, could you comment on how current city policies and policies at the county level mesh with the requests that are being made in these letters, please?
Sure. Not having it right in front of me, I will say that one of the actions that you'll see on the list of actions that we've taken is to stop water utility shutoffs. Tonight before you is a discussion that you'll have on rental eviction suspensions or restrictions associated with evictions. And we are right now, just on tonight's Tuesday night, the governor announced funds that would be coming to local counties to help serve our unsheltered and homeless population through COVID-19. So we are in communication with County Department of Health and Human Services about how those monies will roll out into the communities. We have added porta potties and hand washing stations at the community center and at Arcata House Partnerships Annex, and have really been trying just to see if there's other needs that Arcata House Partnership, as our primary partner in serving that population, has at this point. But we are really in the infancy of being able to see those monies. I mean, the money itself isn't here yet in Humboldt County, but we do hope to have an update for the council specific to that by your April 1st meeting, and hope to be able to have some additional strategies in place. The county has reserved a block of rooms in a hotel for if someone in the homeless population has symptoms and is awaiting test results, they will be sheltered at that period. And if that test comes back positive through that treatment period, they will also be sheltered in that block of hotel rooms and be provided meals. So certainly happy to have a further discussion, but those are some of the immediate steps that we've taken.
Karen, could you please poll the members of the council to see if they have further comments or responses to the public comments that were submitted?
Sure. Vice Mayor Patino?
No more comment. Thank you.
Councilmember Watson?
Just my comments earlier, and if there's anyone disagreed that maybe we should update the language around our emergency declarations.
And Councilmember Pereira?
No, thank you, though.
I have no further comments, so could you do a poll of the council members on the motion that has been made and seconded, please?
Sure. Vice Mayor Patino?
Yes.
Councilmember Watson?
Yeah.
Councilmember Pereira?
Aye.
Mayor Winkler?
Yes.
Motion passes.
Right. Next is item B, consider adopting urgency ordinance number 1532, adopting temporary restrictions on eviction of tenants due to non-payments of rent. May we start with a staff report from City Attorney Diamond?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and good evening, council members and staff. This is based on the direction the council provided at its March 18th council meeting. I have prepared a draft urgency ordinance for your consideration, which would impose restrictions on tenant evictions due to the non-payment of rent during the COVID-19 emergency. It is an urgency ordinance, which means that you could adopt it tonight and it would become effective immediately. And that is based on a determination that you would be making through the ordinance adoption process that the immediate need to preserve the public health and safety exists, and therefore you are taking this action. I have in the proposed ordinance provided in section 1 findings and purposes that are intended to support the urgency finding that you need to make, and you are certainly welcome to revise those as you see fit. The council's authority to adopt an ordinance like this derives initially from the city's police powers, and the city's police powers are those that are initially conveyed from the California Constitution. The California courts have defined the contours of those powers. They are of necessity fluid and broad, but we also have as additional authorization for this particular urgency ordinance the governor's executive order, which was issued March 16, executive order N-28-20, in which he specifically suspended any state laws that would preempt or otherwise restrict the city's exercise of police powers if it chooses to restrict or limit the tenant evictions during this time of the COVID-19 emergency. The ordinance is structured, I hope, in a very straightforward manner. It starts, as I already mentioned, with the Section 1 findings and purposes. Section 2 is the bulk of the ordinance, and in that there is initially a prohibition stated against the eviction of a tenant due to inability to pay rent caused by the COVID-19 emergency. Any tenant who is seeking to avoid eviction because of financial inability to pay must establish the financial ability to pay is in fact a substantial decrease in household or business income that is caused by one of four factors: a layoff, a reduction in the number of compensable hours of work, a substantial out-of-pocket medical expense, or a substantial decrease in business income caused by a reduction in opening hours or consumer demand. And additionally, in order to establish financial inability to pay, the tenant must also demonstrate that the tenant decrease in household or business income or the incurred out-of-pocket medical expenses was caused by the COVID-19 pandemic and any of the federal, state, or local emergency responses to the pandemic. These two components that actually define financial inability to pay are taken directly from the governor's order. They mirror exactly what the governor's executive order N-28-20 stated as defining the scope of his suspension of any potential state law that would conflict with the city's ability to impose these kinds of restrictions. That defines the financial inability to pay. In order for a tenant to actually take advantage of the protection, the ordinance is structured in Section 2, subsection D, with several component parts that must be followed by the tenant. The first is a notification requirement. The tenant must actually notify the landlord of an inability to pay, financial inability to pay. The second is that the tenant follows up with that with documentation of the financial inability to pay for the purposes that are defined in this ordinance. The tenant must additionally demonstrate that the decrease in the household or business income has not been offset by the receipt of any of the government-sponsored financial supports that are now being made available through unemployment insurance or other types of stipends, grants, or loans. And lastly, the tenant must pay the portion of rent that the tenant is able to pay. Now, these are factors that are all discretionary with the council, and the council is welcome to add or delete any of these. I have a couple of points within these that I would like specific direction from the council before it takes action to adopt the ordinance, if in fact the council chooses to do that. I set those out in my staff report, and then in the body of the proposed ordinance I tried to identify the areas in which I've basically placed potential placeholder language and identified that with italics and yellow highlighting. And so the first of these excuse me, specific points that I would like the council to address is whether the council would like this ordinance to apply to residential and commercial tenancies, or one or the other. And that is in Section 2A of the proposed ordinance. The second is the timing around notification to the landlord and the follow-up of the actual documentation. I've put in the proposed ordinance as placeholder that the tenant is obligated to notify the landlord before the day the rent is due. Obviously, the council may change that in any way it chooses. And then I have a follow-up of the documentation within 7 days after that notification. Additionally, I have in Section 3 of the proposed ordinance a payment period in which the tenant would be obligated to repay. This is, again, totally within the discretion of the council. This, as I've said it here for your discussion purposes, would provide a 120-day payment period that would start after the expiration of the ordinance, and that after the expiration of the ordinance is the last component that I would like you to discuss and come to decision on. I have placed in Section 7 of the ordinance that the urgency ordinance would expire on May 31 unless extended. May 31 is the date that the governor's executive order issued in N-28-20 is set to expire. Obviously, that can be any date the council chooses. And again, as I said, anything in this ordinance is subject to the council's revision as it sees fit. So that concludes my staff report.
Could we please have a roll call of the council members to see if they have any initial comments on the proposed ordinance?
Sure. Vice Mayor Patino?
Hi. I'm concerned about foreclosures. This doesn't cover any of the foreclosures at all, as far as I can tell. It's just tenant rent. So is there any way we can hook this into foreclosures?
You are correct. This is only tenant rent. The governor has aggressively gone after mortgage payments that are currently obligated, and has evidently, I have not had a chance to research this. I believe it's in some of the documentation that the city manager provided you from the Cal OES pages. Or is that, no, I'm sorry. It's on the notes from the governor's press conference yesterday. The governor announced a 90-day waiver for mortgage payments for those impacted by COVID-19 from banks, and to date, apparently 4 of the 5 largest institutions and all state-chartered banks have agreed to honor 90-day waivers. The Bank of America is an exception and has committed to a 30-day waiver, not 90 days. Now, obviously, that is not all of the particular interests that could initiate a foreclosure, but I think it's the bulk of the commercial industry. Obviously, a private mortgage could initiate a foreclosure. We could go back and look at adding that if that is the council's desire, or we can see if the governor continues to take an aggressive stand on that. I also saw in one of the updates from a recent governor press release that he is watching this very closely, and he may actually himself adopt a statewide moratorium on evictions as well as additional foreclosure relief.
Thank you. I'm also concerned about mobile home space rent. Is that specifically covered in this?
Yes, we've got David Loya on. Maybe David, you could address that. Is he here?
Sorry, I was having trouble unmuting. I can't say definitively that mobile home space rent would be covered in this, but it appears to me it would, because this is for residential rent. I don't see why we couldn't make it more explicit, and I can look for a place to do that. Maybe in Section 2A, this urgency ordinance applies to all residential tenants, including mobile home space rent.
That would help me. Thank you. I think that's all my questions at this point.
Okay, Councilmember Pereira?
No questions, just a process question. Are we going to go over kind of each of those decision points and do a roll call individually for that, or are we going through individually as council members? Mayor, what's your call on that?
Given the format in which we're operating, I think the best would be to do a roll call of each council member expressing opinion on each of the decision points. And so I think we should do, I'm sorry, we would do the decision, we would poll each decision point around the council members and understand where the council members stand on that point, and then go on to the next point.
Okay, maybe I'll suggest that at least in initial questions, if you also could answer if you would like it to cover residential and commercial, or just one or the other. And maybe we'll just go back to Vice Mayor Patino quick, if you just let us know, did you want both residential or commercial?
I just want residential.
Okay. All right, Councilmember Pereira on residential and commercial?
I would like both residential and commercial, but I also would like it explicitly to include mobile home renters as well, the spaces.
Okay. All right, Councilmember Watson, so the question is residential and or commercial, and then any other questions that you have initially?
Yeah, I'm fine with both of those. And initially, I just know that there were potentially some other provisions the mayor was interested in, but I'll let him explain those himself.
All right, and then Mayor, would you like residential and commercial?
I would like residential and commercial.
Okay, so there's 3 of you that would like both residential and commercial, and 1 that was residential only at this point. All right, Mayor, did you have any initial questions?
I have some initial comments that, in my mind, the ideal situation would be if the tenant could approach the landlord and attempt to make a good faith effort to reach a compromise with the landlord, if that's at all possible. So I'm suggesting making that a requirement. And the way I word this is tenant must first document that they have made a good faith effort to reach a compromise agreement with their landlord and have been unsuccessful in doing so. Let's see. Also, if before the crisis, if we set a firm date, if before the crisis that the landlord was already in the process, had already initiated an eviction process against the tenant, that this ordinance would not stop that process. Because if there were reasons the landlord felt that evictions should occur before there was any crisis. And also, if during the period of this, if the behavior of the tenant in respects other than non-payment of rent, such as being a danger to the property, being a danger to other tenants, or for other valid reasons separate from non-payment, that the landlord should be able to continue with that eviction process. And let's see. Also, that I wanted to be clear that at the end of the period specified by the council, that in order for the eviction restrictions to continue, there must be a positive majority vote by the council to continue the eviction restrictions.
Attorney Nancy Diamond, could you maybe go through those points from the mayor and talk through what you believe is covered and maybe what isn't in the current version?
Yes, thank you. So if I understand your first point, I understand that having the tenant and the landlord try and develop a compromise agreement is a good idea in advance. I'm not sure how we would monitor that. That would be a private agreement between the landlord and the tenant, and I don't think we want to be in a position of having to monitor or referee that kind of an agreement. The tenant may believe that it has, in good faith, attempted a compromise, and the landlord may believe otherwise. So I'll stop there, and I'll go on to the other few points, and then hear what the rest of the council thinks. Your interest in, I think, two-part interest. First, in making certain that any current evictions not be impacted or halted, and second, that evictions for other purposes be allowed to proceed. As background to both of those points, the court has, our local court, which is where an eviction would be processed, has suspended all civil proceedings for the most part. A few exceptions, obviously emergency civil proceedings will proceed largely until the middle of April. So without any action by us, any ongoing eviction, unless it's an emergency type of situation, has been suspended by the courts. The ordinance that's proposed contains in it restrictions so that the eviction is suspended. The ability to evict a tenant under the ordinance is restricted only as to the situation where the tenant is unable to pay rent because of a COVID-19 response. So the inability to pay rent for any other reason is not impacted by this ordinance. Whatever the court process is around that and the COVID-19 response that the courts are currently implementing is out of our control. In regard to after the eviction, after the emergency and the expiration of the moratorium, the tenant would be responsible to pay rent. So it's not forgiven. I know that's not your direct question, but it does bear on the ability of a tenant to avoid paying rent during this time period or not. And then your third point, a positive majority vote to continue. I believe that's getting at the Section 7 termination component, so that you would require it be extended by action of the council. And that would be the default because this is an urgency ordinance. The council would take action to amend or extend the ordinance itself. So I don't know if, Michael, you want to respond first, or if you want to ask the other council members for responses, or if you have any other questions for me.
I wanted to clarify point one, which would be that staff would be the judge of and so if the the tenant or the landlord presented information that would demonstrate, if the tenant presented information that would show a good faith effort, it would be up to staff to judge whether the tenant had made a good faith effort. And so it would be a staff decision, as would this entire granting of restriction on eviction would be a staff decision to the application by a tenant, in my understanding, is the way I was thinking of point number one.
Okay, thank you. So I'll just let the council weigh in on that.
All right, so could we poll the council members to see if they have comments on this?
Okay, so let's start with Vice Mayor Patino. If you go ahead.
Yeah. Who is going to be the judge of the paperwork? I mean, somebody says, "Hey, I can't make the rent. Here's my paperwork," and who do they? Who's the judge? I guess. I mean, the mediator between the landlord and the tenant.
So it would be actually, the way this is drafted, not the role of the city. The tenant would present the information to the landlord, and the landlord would say that is acceptable, or the landlord would say that is not acceptable and would proceed to evict. In which case then the city has two potential courses of action. One, it could attempt to intervene in the eviction proceeding and argue that there is a violation of the ordinance, or it could seek to impose its ordinance against the landlord through the ordinary administrative or civil criminal process that the court that the city has for any ordinance violation. There is a third option, which is that the judge would be then in the eviction process would be making a determination even without the city's intervention in the action.
Thank you.
Paul, while we're going through, Vice Mayor Patino, do you have an opinion on the next item of discussion? And we'll go through each of them, of course, and the rest of you will have a chance to weigh in on the mayor's comments. But the two time frames that the city attorney has laid out, first is the tenant would need to notify the landlord 7 days prior to not paying the rent, and then would have, wait, is that wrong? Nancy, go ahead.
Well, and this again can be set up however the council desires. What I have proposed is a two-step process. One is an informal notification to the landlord of a prospective inability to pay rent, and that would be then the second component followed up with the paperwork.
Okay, so notice to the landlord, and then within 7 days producing documentation to that effect. Is that a
Right.
time frame that you support?
Yeah, I'm okay with the before the rent is due to notify, and the 7 days after notification to provide documentation. And I also, you know, I'll pull my resistance to residential and commercial. Okay. Thank you.
Okay. All right, Councilmember Pereira.
I agree with Vice Mayor Patino about the timeline that's been proposed for both the notification in writing to the landlord and to the proof that will be provided to the landlord.
And Councilmember Watson.
I'm sorry, is there a specific question or is this just comments?
It is comments around the request of the mayor, and then adding one additional specific question from the city attorney, which is, are you comfortable with the tenant just making notification to the landlord prior to the rent being due that they'll be unable to make that payment, and then within 7 days providing that documentation, or would you like a different timeline around that?
That sounds agreeable to me. And I'm still just kind of processing and formulating my thoughts on the mayor's comments. So maybe we can come back to me on that.
Okay, so then, Mayor, would you like to weigh in on the notification and the documentation within 7 days?
I support those provisions.
Okay. Do you have anything else you'd like to bring up? And then we can go through maybe the payment period. We might as well start with you. Any other comments right now, or the payment period being, basically 3 months, 120 days from the expiration of the ordinance for the repayment period of the past due rent? Does that time frame support your ideas?
Is that a question for me?
Yeah. If you had anything else, and then we'll start with that one as well, the 120 days.
120 days is fine. The only other comment that I would make is that ability to pay, if there's a cosigner on the lease, then the ability to pay should also include the ability of the cosigner to pay.
Okay, Vice Mayor Patino, the existing question is, are you comfortable with repayment being 120 days after the ordinance expires? And then if you would like to comment on the ability of a cosigner to be part of this process as well.
Yeah, I agree with the cosigner and also the 120 days.
All right, Councilmember Pereira.
I agree with both of those points.
All right, and Councilmember Watson.
I know that the mayor had initially thrown around a 60-day period, and I was just wondering, I just wanted to clarify that he had changed his mind to 120 days.
No, I'm sorry that, no, I would prefer the 60-day period.
So yeah, I mean, I'm willing to talk about it, but I'd be more inclined to go with the 60-day period as well. And if needed, or we could always extend it. Seems.
So would you like to go through, Nancy, what other questions do you have in terms of filling out?
I didn't hear, and I know that Councilmember Pereira, I think I could see, has not yet responded to these points. I sort of felt like she was, no? Okay, I misunderstood the visual cue. But I do want to hear from the other two, the next time you take a roll call from Councilmember Watson and Winkler about the mobile home, extending the ordinance not only to commercial and residential, but to also the mobile home space rent, because I don't think either of them explicitly weighed in on that. And, I'm sorry, one other thing. Okay, I'm really sorry. One other thing, the next time you do your roll call, is that the expiration date of the ordinance.
Karen, you're muted.
That is just absolutely not going to work. All right, so I was going to, why don't we start, Sophia, you're up. So right now she's got it expiring May 31st in conjunction with the governor's order. Is that a date that you're comfortable with?
Something that I saw with, I believe, the City of Sacramento's ordinance was that while the governor's executive order may have that date now, it's possible that it could be extended. So I would actually rather tie it to the end date of the executive order, recognizing that this could go on longer than that. I mean, we all hope that it wouldn't, but I think from a logistical standpoint, it'd be, I think, a bit simpler to tie it to that action. So that's what I would recommend.
All right, Vice Mayor Patino.
Yeah, I agree with Sophia. I think that the termination date of the ordinance should be the same as the executive orders of the governor. Karen's muted. Are you muted? Oh.
Are you good? All right.
Yeah, I'm good.
Okay, Councilmember Watson. So the question is on the date of expiration, and then
In the mobile homes.
and mobile homes.
So I'm yes on extending to mobile homes. And my question to Nancy is, if we do, 60 or 120 days requirement for the tenant to settle up with the landlord, how does that work with if, for example, the governor extends it to like August, that exceeds the 120 days? Would, let's just say in the 60-day example, they basically would be allowed to be 2 months behind?
The ordinance as proposed reads that the payment period, the repayment period, doesn't start until the end of the ordinance. And so if the governor extends the executive order, then the 60 days or the 120. And we do need to go back through to the council, because right now I've got a 2-2 split on that number. But that time period doesn't run until the end of the order. Right now it's May 31. If it gets extended, it would be down the road.
So I guess what I'm imagining is whatever days we go with, if the date gets extended and we have a tenant that qualifies for this and it gets pushed, beyond May 31st, I mean, the tenant is just digging a bigger and bigger and bigger hole. And I think, it just becomes more and more unrealistic that they're going to be able to catch up on all that rent. So I don't know. I guess I don't want to help with the hole digging for this person, just coming at it from that angle. If there was, I don't know. I'd like to have it to where, I just don't want somebody to find themselves in a position where they owe 4, 5, 6 months of rent. I don't know how we would fit that into this.
Well, it's up to the council at this point to identify the policy around this point. Should the repayment period begin before the end of these various emergency situations, the one executive order from the governor or not? Should this just be a grace period for a fixed amount of time, regardless of the termination date of that executive order? So I think once the council has weighed in on that, then we can look to craft language into the ordinance.
So I guess, I'm focusing on how many days we're talking about, 60 days or 120 days. My understanding is you're saying that starts as soon as if we pinned it, for example, like Councilmember Pereira suggested, if it was tied to what the governor had determined as an end date. To me, then if it goes in, even if it's just May 31st and then 4 months after that, the tenant wouldn't have to start. I guess so if it ends and the tenant doesn't owe rent for 120 days, they then need to start paying on their rent for the next month and then also start catching up on the rent from the prior month. Does that sound right, Nancy?
Right, exactly. Once the ordinance terminates, they're obligated to, I should say they're always obligated to pay rent. All the ordinance does is provide protection from eviction. So that the obligation remains, and we haven't changed that at all. Once the ordinance ends, they are no longer protected, and so they could be then immediately given a pay or quit notice. And if they can't pay, the rent, then they would go into the process, the court process.
And I guess I'm just, I know one of the mayor's, or really maybe his main objective here was to make something that was balanced for both parties. And I guess I'm thinking of a scenario where a tenant owes 4 months rent and maybe more, and then they're just not able to pay it back. And we're in a sense creating a situation where, one, the tenant is not going to be able to catch up on so many months of rent, and then two, now the property owner is out thousands of dollars per tenant that qualifies under this and decides not to, if they leave the area, they just can't do it, whatever it is. I don't know, I just feel like it's a long period of time that's going to create a larger financial burden, and the larger that burden is, the harder it's going to be for tenants to dig themselves out of it. So I don't know. I mean, I would almost lean, I guess I would still stick with 60 days just to try to minimize that time period and just try to create some, a little bit of pressure to get the payments going again.
Okay, I'll just jump in. It looks like Vice Mayor Patino has something he'd like to say. Why don't we start with that? I know we do have quite a bit of public comment, and then I can tell you where I think we have agreement and where I think we need to come to agreement if you want to move forward with this item after that.
I was thinking that on the 60 and 120 day prepayment period, that maybe we could come to an agreement so we could move on at 90 days. It's not the 120, but it's a little bit longer than the 60. So maybe Brett and Michael could support the 90 day.
Mayor, do you have anything you'd like to add or answer to that? Or would you like to take public comment at this time?
Well, I'll defer to Councilmember Watson on this point. Well, what I would say is actually that I would like to keep it at 60 days, and this council still has the opportunity to extend it. So I would rather stick with 60 days, bring it back to the council if we feel that we need to extend it. And Councilmember Watson's concerned about piling up of back rent and debt of the tenant and loss of income of the property owner, I think, are major concerns that I have. So I would like to just keep sticking with 60 days.
Is this assuming that all of the council agrees with the revision so that the termination date of the urgency order is now, quote, at the end date? I mean, the urgency ordinance is now consistent with, quote, the end date of the executive order? Or is the termination date fixed at May 31?
I want it to be a fixed date to come back to the council and not be tied to the governor's executive order.
Are you okay with May 31, Michael?
31 is 60 days, April and May, so that's consistent with what we've been talking about.
Yeah, I'm okay with that. To clarify, with the May 31st end date, it, basically just at the very least, have the council meet and discuss it and decide, any extensions we want to do to it.
I have a question on the 120-day payment period. How do we change that? I mean, it seems like if we set it at 60 or 120 days, it's fixed. I'm hearing Michael say we can come back and change that, but I'm not sure that that's true.
So if I can try to clarify, I think there's three different parts to this equation. One is, when does the urgency ordinance terminate? Is it going to terminate on a fixed date, subject to extension of the council? Is it going to terminate on the date the executive order of the governor terminates? Right now, we know what that is, but it may be extended. That's question one. Question two is, if there is going to be a prepayment period that the council chooses to establish, should that, number two part of my three-part test question is, does that start when the ordinance ends, or does that start at a different time? And then the third question is, how long is that period? From whenever it starts, is it going to be 60 days or 120 days? So there's three different parts of this question that have been kind of combined in your discussion. I think everybody is on board with starting the prepayment period when the ordinance ends, but I don't hear consensus in when the ordinance ends, and then I don't hear consensus on how long the time period should be when the ordinance does end. Now, I am maybe misunderstanding, and maybe there isn't even consensus on when the prepayment period should begin.
So for me, terminates May 31st. It begins, the forgiveness period begins when it ends, or as far as the time period they have to pay it back when it terminates. And within 60 days after that is how I feel about it right now.
All right, Councilmember Pereira.
Yeah, so I mean, I've already stated my preference for it to be just tied with the executive order. I mean, the flip side of this is, you know, if we magically get this over with before May 31st, it also would mean that it would end at the point where the governor ends it, if it's even before May 31st. So I think logistically on either side, whether it's ending the executive order early or extending it, I would argue, I think tying it to that would make a lot of sense. And I do believe the payment period should begin once the ordinance has ended, which is why I also think it needs to be tied to the executive order, because the reason we're doing this is because of the orders to shelter in place, the impacts to businesses, and these public health measures that are being executed that have this ripple effect in our community. So to me, our action is tied to the executive order that the governor has issued. Lastly, I think to Councilmember Watson's point about the concern about tenants digging themselves up in a hole, you know, obviously there are going to be lots of financial impacts that we're already seeing, you know, from COVID-19. So to me, that's actually an argument of why we do need 120 days to give, once this ordinance ends, to give people 4 months to get caught up on the back paid or the back unpaid rent that they were not able to pay during the COVID-19 spread that was happening. So to me, the more flexibility we give for folks to be able to pay that back over the course of 120 days, I think actually will help people to be able to become full, you know, be able to pay back fully, rather than giving a 60-day timeline when we think realistically at the point where an order like this is going away, it's not like the economy gets back and booming right away. People are going to slowly get back their jobs or the hours. And I mean, what normalcy looks like, we have no idea. So I think the more flexibility we can give, giving a little bit more breathing room to pay back You know, the 120 days is not totally an arbitrary number. It's something other cities have looked at too. I believe the city of San Francisco, I think for them, it's even 6 months. So I think 4 months is very reasonable. I think 60 days is, I think, not realistic when you think of how people budget. This ordinance does state in it under, let's see, section 2, D4, that the tenant still needs to pay the portion of the rent that the tenant is able to pay. So, you know, maybe for some folks that means absolutely zero, but I think for a lot of folks, you know, there still will be some payments that are being made to landlords. But I think giving people time to pay that back, I think is the right thing to do.
All right. Are there any other council comments at this point, or would you like me to open for public comment?
I'd like to say that I agree completely with Sophia's logic and the time of 120 days, and that the date should coincide with the governor's orders, governor's termination date. Thank you.
Right.
Yeah, and I'll just go ahead, Michael.
Oh,
go ahead.
So far, none of the council members have responded to my suggestion that the tenant needs to demonstrate a good faith effort to go to work out a settlement with the landlord, because I think that's an important point, and it's preferable to having it imposed by us as the legislative body. So I would appreciate if other council members would weigh in on that point.
I agree that they should be able to produce something showing they're making a good faith effort. What that is, what we would qualify, I don't know. Maybe that's just a decision made by the staff, but I do agree that's a reasonable expectation if they're asking for this forgiveness.
You know, for me, one of the common complaints that I have from tenants is that they call the property management, they call their landlord, they're not responded to. So my concern is that the tenant can make a good faith effort and still not be able to contact them. And who makes the determination that they did or didn't make the good faith effort? I think we have to believe that them giving notification before the rent is due is sufficient as far as I'm concerned.
I agree with Councilmember Patino. I don't think this is necessary to include for a few other reasons. One, I think this adds an unnecessary layer in an emergency situation, and however we can streamline a process so that people can get the assistance that they need, I think that's really imperative. So I think it's an unnecessary layer that I think is well-intentioned. I think most people in this community, I mean, we've heard from landlords already that have shared their perspective that they are already working with their tenants to try and resolve issues. And so to me, what we're talking about here, this ordinance is not meant to be punitive in any shape or form, but being able to provide assistance during a really difficult time, an emergency situation. You know, I think at the point where a tenant needs to go to their landlord and make this notification, that is a very difficult thing for someone to do, to say, I have been financially impacted by this. I'm stressed out. My kids may be home with me and I'm having to watch them and try and make sure they're getting an education. I mean, this is a stressful time for everyone. So I think however we can make this as clean cut and clear as possible, I think just makes the most sense. So I think the point raised by the mayor and Councilmember Watson, I think is very well intentioned. I appreciate the sentiment behind it, because I do believe most people in this community are working in good faith and are really trying to support each other. But I don't think we need that extra layer.
So it just seems like without that layer, basically anybody between now and when rent's due can not pay their rent under this and not have to provide, any evidence that they've been trying to contact their landlord. So I guess that's my concern with it.
I guess the thing I would say to that, though, is that this is not just folks just saying, oh, I'm not paying the rent. These are folks that have to be able to provide within 7 days of that written notification verification of their circumstances and how COVID-19 has impacted their ability to pay rent or a percentage of their rent. So to me, this is not just a carte blanche for people to just say, oh, I'm not going to pay my rent. I'm really just recognizing the impacts of COVID-19. That's not going to affect every single renter. But for those that are going to be impacted, let's make it as, these folks that are having to deal with COVID-19 and how it's impacted their livelihood already have to go through bureaucracy for unemployment insurance or other types of government assistance programs. I just feel like let's make this as clean cut as possible for people to get the assistance that they need.
I mean, if we're already asking them to provide written notification, to me that's acceptable. That would, be a document they can produce that in good faith they were communicating with their landlord. So I feel like it, we can all get what we want on this one.
Okay, so I'm hearing that as the notification needs to be in writing. The notification to the landlord that they're unable to pay rent needs to be before the rent is due and in writing. Okay, why don't I read through where I think we're in agreement, and the city attorney can weigh in at the end. I believe we have agreement that this would cover both residential and commercial, that the notification from the tenant to the landlord has to be before the rent is due and has to be in writing. And then 7 days past that period of notification, they need to provide documentation for specifically that shows how COVID-19 has affected their ability to pay that rent. We will add mobile home space rent unit to, or space rental to the ordinance, and that the prepayment period will start the day that the ordinance ends. We seem to still need to work through the date that the ordinance would terminate, whether that's tied to the executive order of the governor or a date specific, and then the number of days to repay that rent starting from that date of termination. Have I missed anything, Nancy?
No, I think you got it all very well. Thank you.
I hadn't weighed in that I supported it for mobile homes also. I hadn't made a comment on that before, but that you were right about that, Sharon.
All right, thank you for that. Should we go to public comment and then come back on those final two items, Mayor? What's your wish?
Let's go to public comment now.
Okay, we do have quite a bit of public comment on this topic, so I'm just going to remind that there's a 3-minute limit, so I'm going to try to adhere to that as best I can. The first comment comes from Denise Ziegler. It reads, can they hear me? Am I audible?
Yep, we can hear you, Danielle.
Okay, yeah. Sorry about that. Okay, so the first comment reads, so besides stamping all over private property rights, is the city going to do their part and not turn off water sewer for non-payment? Are our garbage cans, I was told by the city they are a quasi-city service, going to still get picked up when we can't pay? Is the city going to be paying the mortgages of properties where the tenants don't have to pay rent in order to keep the property owner from foreclosure or filing bankruptcy? Need to know in case of class action lawsuits. Thank you, Denise Ziegler, homeowner. The next comment comes from Linda and Jan Dirksen, as well as Lynn Matthews, Mary Ella Anderson. These are all mobile homeowners, as well as Hillary Mosher, Regional Manager of Golden State Manufactured Homeowners League. It reads, hello, City Council members. We want to submit a public comment on urgency ordinance number 1532, adopting temporary restrictions of the eviction of tenants due to non-payment of rent. Please make certain that the proposed Arcata Ordinance 1532 applies to mobile home residents in all of Arcata's mobile home parks. As you know, although we own our homes, we are also tenants because we rent land where our mobile homes are located. The San Jose moratorium on eviction specifically includes mobile homes, and a hyperlink is provided. Begin quote. The San Jose City Council has enacted a temporary eviction moratorium in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. The moratorium is in effect through April 17th, and the City Council may extend it. Here is a fact sheet about the moratorium in 3 languages. Here is information landlords need to know about the moratorium. Here is the official emergency ordinance that put the moratorium into effect. The moratorium applies to all residential properties in San Jose, including single-family homes, rooms rented in single-family homes, duplexes, condominiums, income-restricted apartments, i.e. affordable housing, rent-stabilized apartments, market-rate apartments, and mobile homes. Please note the moratorium only applies to residential evictions for non-payment of rent due to impacts of COVID-19 outbreak. There is no moratorium on lawful evictions or other just causes, end quote. Arcata City Council members, please ensure that the Arcata's Eviction Ordinance 1532 specifically includes mobile homes that are located in Arcata mobile home parks. Thank you. The next comment comes from Chris Chadwick. It reads, please take into consideration the written proposal provided to the Council via email earlier today with specific recommended changes to the ordinance. In regards to the budget fiscal impact section of the staff report, I find it ironic that the cost to the city or any government agency is $0 when the residential landlords of Arcata will be exposed to up to $10 million if the ordinance is passed as proposed, and another $5 million each additional month if extended beyond 60 days. Please see charts below. The exposure for me is $20,000 as written and an additional $10,000 for each 30-day extension with no payments due for 6 months. Please see the charts below. This is in light of almost every other business type has access to grants, tax forgiveness, and low-cost loans. Most working people will be paid unemployment insurance. Landlords do not qualify any business relief, and most individual landlords will not even qualify for unemployment insurance. My bank will work with the landlords for 60 days before they apply the screws. This is a huge gap between the ordinance and the landlord's bank to fill. My complaint is not that you are asking us to have compassion and help tenants. The issue is potentially requiring landlords to extend credit for a minimum of 6 months to tenants while no one is supporting the landlord. Furthermore, no one seems to understand and or care how much impact this ordinance can have on landlords. As written, this ordinance has the strong possibility of bankrupting landlords and putting some of them out of their homes. This type of ordinance is short-sighted and fundamentally flawed. If adopted as written, the results will simply kick the can down the road. When this ordinance ends, most of the tenants will not be able to pay the past due rent. The landlords will be in the same place they would have been without an ordinance. We will have to sit down with the tenants and work out an agreement to forgive part of and up to all of the past due rent on a case-by-case basis. Smart landlords will understand it is often best to keep a tenant in your building even if they can only pay a portion of the rent going forward. This is especially true in a down market. The key to success is keeping the communication open and honest. The landlord and tenant bad actors and go back to poor behavior. In many cases with student tenants, they will move out on a school year end and have no incentive to ever pay the past due rent since former tenants no longer need anything from the landlord that is carrying the debt. I've written and spoke with multiple public servants. I proposed some new ideas to help support the landlords while they are supporting tenants. Some people were sympathetic to my concerns, but none appeared willing to be creative and investigative ways to share some landlords' exposure. The city is potentially mandating landlords to become banks to loan money to many people that are not worth of this amount of credit. He submits additional comments. If tenant does not notify as prescribed, what are the consequences? I am a landlord. My bank will defer 60 days for me. At this point, I need to become current with all payments. Please recognize the city's proposal as written requires the landlord to carry debt for a minimum of 180 days. The cosigner is part of the proof of hardship. How do you view the cosigner? Does the council recognize, as written, the eviction freeze is 60 days with payment due 120 days after the end of the freeze? In other words, 6 months. And the next comment comes from Nezzy Wade. It reads, hello, council and staff. My name is Nezzy Wade, board president for AHHA, Affordable Homeless Housing Alternatives. I am involved with a number of formal organizations here in Humboldt that focus on housing issues, from funding to varying programs and services and developments related to an alternative affordable options for those experiencing homelessness, such as legal places to camp and parking programs as well as micro-house villages. My comment regarding agenda item 3B is noted below. Governor Newsom issued an executive order that allows cities and counties to stop landlords from evicting tenants who miss their next payment if local governments want to do so. I am encouraging the City Council to want to do it and to do it. Adopt Urgency Ordinance 1532. Make it a reality for the community. I agree with many tenants' rights groups who feel the governor's order did not go far enough and that we need a statewide ban, which would make it possible for low-income renters to have the ability to shelter in place and self-quarantine and take the measures needed to protect themselves and their families rather than being forced out of the very homes we ask them to take refuge in. We do not need any more people displaced or on the streets. Thank you and wishes of wellness to you all. Nancy Wade also submitted an additional comment. I really dislike placing many restrictions on being able to meet the eligibility requirements for not being evicted from one's residence for COVID-19. The ordinance is needed, but is very constrictive, narrowly beneficial. Placing so many restrictions on one's ability to obtain the benefit intended to relieve those renters affected by lack of ability to pay rent due to the impacts of COVID-19. These are really big hoops to jump through for many people in 60 days. We need to give people some time to recover. Some will recover quickly, but keep in mind that the poor pay more always. They need more time to recover from loss of income and the loss of ability to recoup income and other losses, which could even be for the repossession of furniture for some. The month of May seems like a very narrow window in which to be able to do this, just with the notion of processing the documentation that will be needed. Will staff have the understanding that it is needed to handle these decisions relative to poverty and diversity of circumstances? 120 days, even 4 months, is going to create conditions that will result in displacement. I repeat, rather than being forced out of the very homes we ask them to take refuge in, we do not need any more people taking up residence on the sidewalks. And the final comment comes from Anna Brooks, and it reads, greetings. I'm writing in regards to the emergency ordinance proposal and the situation at hand facing our community. The shelter-in-place order requires just that, shelter. I am a physically disabled citizen as defined by the Fair Housing and Americans with Disabilities Act. I know too well how the disabled fall through the cracks. We need to make sure the elderly and disabled have a safe, secure location during this time, no matter the logistics. Thank you for your attention in this matter. A. Brooks. And that concludes public comment.
I have a couple questions for Nancy. Under Section 2, subsections F and G, packet page 26, I'm just wondering how, if there was an eviction action already in motion before COVID to recover unpaid rent for months before COVID, and then does this pretty much bar any tenant from trying to get this COVID protection and staying where they are if an eviction process is already underway?
I think under subsection F of Section 2, I think that's correct. If there's an eviction process already underway, that is outside the scope of what is intended here. This would be a new eviction process. Under subsection B, nothing is intended to relieve the tenant of liability for unpaid rent after expiration of the ordinance. That has to do with various remedies that a landlord has. Both F and G do get back to Councilmember Winkler's questions about the ordinance, but a landlord has different types of remedies available for non-payment of rent. One is eviction, and another is to just simply sue to collect the unpaid rent with interest, however the lease is established. And so G provides, addresses that. It provides the two components that the tenant is still going to have to pay the rent at some point, that may still be liable to pay whatever interest is accruing on that rent, and none of that is deferred. I'm not sure that exactly answers your question, but it does provide a little bit of explanation about those two sections.
Yeah, and I guess what I'm wondering is, F says is not intended, and then G says is intended. Is that strong enough language? Yeah, I mean, whatever you think. I wasn't trying to just change it because I didn't like the words. I just wanted to make sure. I guess it was enforceable, or someone wasn't, like, well, it wasn't intended to, but it did, so I'm okay.
It's up to the council. I can go either way with both of these changes.
Does the ordinance as written preclude a new eviction action if there is behavior by the tenant other than non-payment of rent that would motivate the landlord to begin a new eviction action?
No. As written, the only protection is non-payment due to financial inability to pay rent arising from the COVID-19 emergency. Any other grounds for eviction are still legitimate grounds for eviction.
So Nancy, I guess in your opinion, there's no difference between saying shall or intended or not intended?
Correct. In this application, it doesn't matter to me either way.
Oh, okay. Then we don't need to change it. That was really just my question, to make sure that the wording as is was basically equal to the word shall.
So I have a question regarding, sorry, I want to make sure we're referring to the section. So section 2D, or sorry, section 2F, excuse me. I actually did have a question about that, about the not intended to stay, toll, or otherwise impact an eviction action. I'm just wondering, Nancy, is there any difference here from what Mayor Winkler is proposing about if someone has not paid their full rent or not paid their rent prior to this, that they wouldn't be eligible even if they did meet the criteria for COVID-19? I'm just curious, because I guess on some level they could be different because someone could not have paid rent prior and not be current on their rent, but the landlord has not initiated an eviction process yet.
Right. So subsection F is specific to an eviction action that already exists. It's not just simply the right to an eviction action, but because it says an action to recover unpaid rent, it means that we have one in process. Having partially paid rent we're not eliminating the protections that a tenant would get if the tenant is unable to pay the remainder of the rent because of COVID-19. So if they've paid 50% up until this week and then now they can't pay any amount, the protections for eviction, from eviction, would go into effect.
Okay, thank you. That is something I do want to talk about. I know Mayor Winkler, that is something you wanted us to weigh in on, was that particular recommendation. I'm happy to wait on discussing that, but if now's an appropriate time, I would be happy to share my thoughts. I'm getting a nod from from Karen because maybe we are at a stage where I guess like have all the other questions for the most part been answered then? It sounds like it. I know we have some disagreements we still need to sort out.
On the two, we have two pieces, I think, really of disagreement, and then the topic that you're talking about now. So why don't we try to get through this one? And then... So
we'll add a third disagreement, I guess, to the list, because why not? In thinking about this recommendation of if someone has not been current on their rent and then they were impacted by COVID-19, which would absolutely make it even harder for them to be current on their rent, and they're able to provide that verification. If they excluding them from this protection, I think is counter really to the one finding that really stuck out to me that we have in this emergency ordinance. So under section 1G, I'm just going to read it out there because for me, this really is the lens in which I'm looking at this ordinance, is this particular finding. So during this emergency and in the interests of protecting the public health and preventing transmission of coronavirus, it is essential to avoid unnecessary displacement of tenants. Prohibiting evictions on a temporary basis is needed until the spread of the virus can be minimized and the emergency restrictions lifted. So for me, when looking at this, if the goal of this ordinance is to keep people housed, to prevent the spread of, and to reduce the spread of disease, then I wouldn't want to parse out if someone was financially struggling before and then they've been clearly impacted financially by COVID-19 for one reason or another that they're able to verify. I don't see why they shouldn't have the protections that are offered up in this emergency ordinance. So for me, we can't ask people to stay home if we're also not trying to create measures to keep them in their homes. And I would hate to see a situation where if someone was financially struggling before, now they've been even more financially impacted that they can verify and prove through COVID-19 that now they are having to take on extra work or pretend to be sick when they're not, or they're caring for someone that's sick at home, but they feel like they have to go in and work some extra shifts to be able to pay the rent. That puts all of us at risk. And so for me, this is about reducing the likelihood of spread. And I would not want to parse this out and say if someone was financially struggling before, an eviction action hasn't been taken against them, that they wouldn't be offered this protection if they can truly show that they've been financially impacted by COVID-19. So I understand the intent behind the recommendation, but I think if we are looking at, section 1G, that finding, I think keeping it as is, I think is consistent with this finding here about keeping people in their homes as much as possible.
I was trying to address was a repeated pattern of late payment, non-payment that hadn't quite risen to the level where the landlord had initiated an eviction action. So not somebody who was 5 or 10 days late with the most recent rent.
I understand, and yet I just feel that if our goal is to keep as many people housed as possible so that they can reduce the spread of disease, that is the public benefit of us putting forward this emergency ordinance. So I understand the sentiment behind it and the intent, but for me, that's not something that I can support, because just because someone was financially struggling before with paying their rent, if they can show that they truly have been impacted by COVID-19, then they should be offered the same protections.
That's a provision I'm probably the least attached to.
Councilmember Pereira, did you want to weigh in on whether or not we try to wrap in the cosigner's ability to pay? I think that we've heard from the other three that support that.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I thought I did say that I support that as well. I mean, that's what a cosigner is for. When my mom was a cosigner for me, she knew she would have been on the hook too. So I get that, but then that also recognizes that, right, cosigners also may not be in a good financial position either, but I think that's absolutely reasonable.
Okay, so Mayor, we still have, I think, the two components being the date of the ordinance termination, either with the governor's executive order or on a specific date. Do we want to start with that one? And I guess anyone can jump in if they have thoughts.
Well, I would like to have us maintain control and deal with the specific, there are specific local conditions, and I would like to retain the authority within the council to decide on the local conditions and need to come back and make a specific extension rather than default to what the governor does on this.
I agree with Michael.
Can we agree on May 31st, 2020?
I agree.
I agree.
I can agree to that, but I think it really needs to be tied to the 120-day repayment schedule. I think giving people that peace of mind of when they're doing their budgeting about how they're going to be repaying this rent that is owed. We are making it very clear that, right, they are still liable for paying anything that was not paid during this period. And I think to Councilmember Watson's point about being concerned about people being in a financial difficulty, I think we come to different conclusions about the timeline, but for me, it's an argument for why we need to provide some more time for them to budget, be able to get back on their feet, and to be able to make these repayments to their landlord. So for me, the really key thing is the 120-day repayment period. The May 31st, right now it does line up with the governor's executive order. I'm not going to fall on my sword for that. But I think the repayment period, I think, is what's going to be most impactful to the people that are going to be covered under this ordinance.
So, I would say, speaking for myself, but also as the only renter on the council and maybe in this entire Zoom chat, I'm sticking with the 60 days. That's the way I perceive the digging the hole issue to be best resolved. And so anything longer than that, I'm not really interested right now. And I think, to me, it's, not that I am completely opposed to 120 days or tying this to the governor's timeline if he extends it beyond May 31st. To me, there's no reason why we need to do that right now. This is something I'm sure we're going to be talking about a lot over the next couple months, and it seems relatively low threshold to just extend it as needed.
I agree that, as I said, that both on the date for this to end, to expire, and for the repayment period, I think it's something that we can revisit. So I agree with Councilmember Watson on this.
I like the 120 days, and I have no problem with being May 31st, 2020. So that's where I am.
So, it seems like we're at a standstill. It seems like we have agreement on May 31st, 2020, which is great that we have agreement on that. Obviously, the sticking point is the repayment period. Vice Mayor Patino, you did bring up earlier in this conversation for us to entertain 90 days. I think 2 months is too quick of a turnaround, but to me, 90 days is better than 60 days. And so if that is something where we can get agreement, I want to echo that recommendation that was brought up earlier and see if there's agreement from at least one of our other colleagues on that point.
I could support.
So
Oh, go ahead.
Okay. Never mind. 90 days is it.
Okay, I can support that.
Thank you, Mayor.
All right, do we want, I can go ahead and just read, or if somebody wants to try their hand at a motion.
I'll make a motion. Goodness, I'm going through the staff report. Okay. So I will make a motion to adopt. Oh, actually, I'm so sorry. Nancy, I have one more question for you.
Oh, good, because I also want to double back on the issue you raised before.
Oh,
That's the section.
What was
section
the
F?
Oh, section
It was,
yeah.
and I think that you and Michael agree to take that out, and I wanted to just make sure that there's at least one more vote to take it out.
Can you repeat that, please, Nancy?
Subsection 2F was Sophia's policy question around tenants that have not been able to make say that was the least important provision for him, and so I want to see if that provision is coming out.
But that's basically unpaid rent before the virus. So we would basically be saying it's not intended to recover that.
No, we're saying that it would not. The Councilmember Pereira's policy point is that somebody may have been struggling to make payment and could not have made full payment at subsection F, and under subsection F is no longer able to have protection under this ordinance.
Yeah. So what I'm backing off on is that basically that if somebody was not up to date on the rent, that they would not be denied protection of this ordinance.
Right.
I'll agree with that, to remove it.
Okay. Thank you.
I agree with that too.
So Nancy, my question for you, thank you for bringing that up, but my question for you also was based on under section 2, let's see, section 2, subsection C, around the criteria for someone that would be able to seek this relief. Does the language include, like, in terms of your interpretation, someone who has wage losses, for example, caring for someone in their home that may have COVID-19, or caring for a child that has been sent home from school based on local policies? I could see with the school one that could be seen as like a local or state government response. But I just wanted to make sure that folks that are in those circumstances are included in this. And I didn't know if it needed to be more explicit, or if you feel what is in here already includes those circumstances in terms of wage losses or loss of business.
So I think that the subsection little 4, subsection Romanet 4. So it's C1 little I little v. A substantial decrease in business income. Oh, I see. Yeah. No. I see exactly what you mean. So the household income is decreased because of new hours that must be, new costs that are incurred, but they may not be related to a wage reduction. Is that your point?
Well, or if someone had to, let's say they didn't have, paid leave, and they had to take time off work because now their child is home from school and there's no child care options, or they're caring for a loved one who has COVID-19 and therefore has to be home with them or provide care for them. I've seen that in other ordinances, that's been addressed, at least not necessarily in the language I've seen in the ordinance, but shown in the fact sheets that describe who is covered. And I'm just not sure if those circumstances are included in this ordinance, or if we need to be more explicit about that, because we know that, I think we all know folks that have had to take, unpaid leave, or their business has been impacted because now they're home, with their kids because there's no school.
We certainly could. Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, I would like to include that, Councilmember Pereira. I think that's a very valid point.
Thank you.
I agree with that also.
I'm fine with that.
Okay, so we would include, let's see, structurally we could add another subsection, Romanet 5, a lowercase v, which would say any decrease in household or business income caused by, and what are you proposing? I have seen this language before, Councilmember Pereira, but I think it is in the ordinances that were adopted before the governor's executive order. It's from the earlier ones that came out. But do you have any language suggestions around this?
Let me see, just looking at my notes that I wrote earlier, let's see, using a reduction or a substantial decrease in, a substantial decrease in household or business income caused by, and then this would be Roman numeral 5, caring for a child due to school closures, or caring for an individual ill with COVID-19 or symptoms relating to COVID,
or other dependent, other dependent.
Mm-hmm. I don't know if that's helpful. Those are kind of, I guess, maybe those are two separate Roman numerals.
Yeah, okay. I agree with both of those. Thank you.
All right, I can add those.
Thank you. If it's all right, I can now go through with making a motion. Thank you, folks, for entertaining those other suggestions. Okay, so I will make a motion to adopt ordinance number 1532, an urgency ordinance of the City Council of the City of Arcata, adopting temporary restrictions on the eviction of tenants due to non-payment of rent, waive reading of the text and consent to read by title only, and this is with the amendments as discussed and agreed upon during this discussion.
Second.
Could I have a roll call, please?
Before we do that, can we please just read off those amendments one more time for the final vote?
Yes, please. From City Manager.
Yes. Okay, so the amendments are, or the updates are to include residential and commercial both, to add mobile home space rent, that the notification to the landlord is before rent is due and it must be in writing, that the ordinance terminates on the specific date of May 31st, 2020, that the repayment period starts on when the ordinance ends, that the repayment must be completed within 90 days, that the cosigner's ability to pay is also considered in the ordinance itself or in the restrictions, and that we are removing section 2, number F, and then section 2C1, we are adding 2 Romanettes. Thank you for the new word.
I know.
Which include a decrease in household income caused by childcare due to school closures or caring for an individual in the household that is COVID-19 positive. Did I miss anything?
And no. Did you say subsection F is being of 2?
Yes.
Section 2 is
being removed. Yeah. All right. Doing that.
My only other question was the language just, requiring that they show good faith effort to communicate with their landlord, and, acceptable document would be the notice they've given to their landlord.
So notification, good faith effort to notify the landlord before rent is due, and be able to provide that proof that well, I think that it was given in writing before that rent was due as a good faith effort. You want to add those words as good faith effort? Is that what I'm hearing?
No, I don't know. I guess I'm just, there was, we had council member Per and I had discussed a little bit just the burden on people to produce a document showing their good faith effort. And I thought, even if it's just, I guess, if it comes down to a dispute between the landlord and the tenant, and if the tenant is able to show, look, here's the letter I gave them, giving them notice, or telling them about my situation, I mean, to me, that's perfectly acceptable.
Yep. So what language could be is that the presentation of these documents demonstrates a good faith effort by the tenant to resolve the situation with rent, something to that effect. Will be taken as demonstration that the tenant has made a good faith effort.
I guess for me, I feel like it's since we're already asking them to notify the landlord or landlord's agent in writing, I think that covers that concern. It's like they're already needing to provide something in writing. So I guess for me, I don't understand I guess we could add language to say that reflects a good faith effort, but I think that's inherent in what we're passing, that in order for them to qualify, they would have to follow those parameters anyways. So I guess maybe I'm getting a little confused about.
I was just trying to amplify on what Councilmember Watson said. It's not vital, but if there's any question, they're making a good faith effort. By producing these documents, it demonstrates that. I mean, it's not vital to me, but
Yeah.
Councilmember Watson, I don't know if how much you desire to have that in there.
Go ahead, Paul. Did you have?
Yeah, I agree that, getting a notification in writing, that is their good faith effort. And I don't think we need to embellish it anymore or make it more wordy.
Yeah, I mean, that's fine. I don't know. I'm just imagining, if the landlord says they never gave me a letter, they have not made a good faith effort, I haven't heard from this tenant, and then it's just a landlord's word versus the tenant. It seems, to some extent, I completely understand people are suffering, but it doesn't mean I don't know that we're doing people a favor by removing every single threshold and hurdle there is to not paying the rent. To some extent, it's a really low threshold, and I think it just ideally guides people to, stay on the right track and understand their commitment, and making sure that they are making a good faith effort on their side as well.
Could we add some kind of clarification that said notify the landlord in writing with a copy provided to the city?
I like that. If it's stamped and the data was accepted, I think that would be outstanding.
I think that's a good idea.
So I'm not necessarily opposed to that, but from a process standpoint, so someone could still submit that letter to the landlord, then they get sent to the city. Those could technically be on different dates. So we would still have the record of when we received it as a city, but that wouldn't be necessary. I guess to just clarify, that would not necessarily be the official record of when the landlord was notified. It would purely just be, we have a record of that documentation in case this did go down a particular path where there needed to be some sort of intervention. Is that's how I'm understanding it, but I just.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying is
Okay.
that, somebody somewhere says, and we would be that somebody, we have a copy of your notification to your landlord. And the argument about whether we date stamped it the day after or the day before, I don't think that is as important as somebody holding a second copy.
Got it. I just wanted to make sure that, yeah, if someone's like, they submitted to their landlord on time and then they're like, oh shoot, I got to send it to the city too, that I wouldn't want that to be the thing that hung them up to show that they made, like they did the right thing in terms of notifying the landlord first. That's the most important person they need to notify. We're not as important to notify in that respect. So I just would want to make sure that that's not creating a layer where it's, that's somehow going to go against them if they actually did all the right stuff in terms of getting it to the landlord and doing the verification with the landlord.
Yeah, I agree. I wouldn't want to make it more complicated. I'm just thinking that if they notify their landlord, somebody besides them and the landlord has got to see that notification. In my mind. So.
No, I don't disagree. I just wanted to think through how the city fits into that picture in terms of maintaining that record and what that means. That's all. I'm not opposed to that step. I just didn't want it to be a barrier to, if they did all the other steps, but they didn't send it right away to the city, that would preclude them from qualifying, essentially. I wouldn't see them as being equal in terms of priority.
Right. So, so maybe we could say that they need to provide the landlord notification in writing before the rent is due, and duplicate notification, a copy of that notification must be presented to the city as soon as possible.
I mean, to me, ideally, go ahead. I was just going to say, I mean, ideally, we would be helping the tenant and us, as us as the people who have to make the decision, the tenant as the, person that's trying to prove that they've done this in a timely manner and in good faith effort. And it's, I'm fine if we want to leave it a little bit loose, but my personal feeling is it's a pretty low threshold just to drop a piece of paper off in the city manager's office or to shoot an email with a copy of the document that they submitted. And then there's a timestamp that's actual evidence. It's not a piece of paper that they walked in with and said that they, gave to the landlord, 5 weeks ago, and the landlord saying that they never got anything. But, so yeah, that's my opinion, but I'm happy if we want to keep it looser, then I'm okay with that too.
So I guess I'm hearing then two different things, because what I'm hearing from you, Councilmember Watson, and I'm not necessarily saying that's a bad way to go, but I just want to make sure I'm understanding the ramifications. So it does sound like, from your interpretation, that this would be kind of used as an official record and therefore they would need to be turning that in pretty timely from when they're submitting it to the landlord, so that we're maintaining, from the city perspective, an official record, being able to document that and verify that they in fact sent that in a day prior to when the rent was due. So I guess that's the thing I'm trying to think through, is just what are the ramifications of adding that language in? I'm not necessarily saying it's a bad way to go. I just want to make sure that we're being very explicit about, what we're asking people to do and what we're asking the city to do in terms of maintaining those records and how they'll be utilized. So maybe it sounds like I'm trying to overcomplicate it, but I just wanted to make sure that we're being really clear about what we're asking folks to do and what we're going to do with that information.
Well, what I would say is require that the tenant submit it to the city within 30 days after they give it to the landlord, which is a very generous time frame. And then the city would stamp it, and it would go into the city files.
I think 30 days is too long, because we're talking about having to produce documentation in 7 days. So I would say, can we link the copy to the city within the 7-day period?
Can I just make a suggestion? If you look at the language of subsection D, so it's section 2D1, it says in the proposed ordinance, notify the landlord or landlord's agent in writing. And I would suggest we put in there with simultaneous copy to the Arcata city manager. And then it would go on before the day rent is due.
That I like that.
I like that. Yeah.
That works.
That's good.
Okay.
All right, so do you want to amend your motion to include that one additional provision?
Yes.
You willing to second that?
Yes.
So no other comments on this, then can we have a roll call of council, please?
Yes. Vice Mayor Patino?
Yes.
Councilmember Watson?
Yes.
Councilmember Pereira?
Aye.
Mayor Winkler?
Yes.
Motion carries. Just a quick point of order. Councilmember Pereira had a question or a comment about actions that we were taking in response to COVID-19, and we sort of skipped over that once we got through our declaration. This entire meeting is dedicated to COVID-19, so I'm happy to go back to all that at the end, but I just didn't want to lose track of it. And,
all I was just going to say, one, appreciate all the actions that are being taken by you and the rest of our staff. One thing that I know has been brought up is the concerns around use of public spaces like the community forest. We had great weather this weekend and people were out recreating, but definitely to a point where it appeared to be defeating the purpose of social distancing and increasing risk of exposure for folks. I know other communities that are much more populated than ours have taken action to, it looks like maybe Brett, there's background noise. But regardless, I know other cities and counties have taken, pretty extreme action around like public parks. State parks, like parking lots are being closed across the state. I'm not advocating for that at this point, but I think, and I know messaging is going out already to the community, but I think if that's something we can continue to reinforce those messages of the importance of social distancing while people are recreating, because I would hate for us to have to get to a point where we're saying people can't use the community forest. I think that would be a really disappointing thing to do, but the stakes are really high. So I think I just want us to make sure that we're keeping an eye on that. And I know you all are, but I think just making sure, since this is a public meeting, to kind of just express that concern that people do need to maintain social distance. Obviously, people need to go out and recreate, but we have to be maintaining distance from each other as well.
Councilmember Vice Mayor Patino?
Yeah, I have a question that came up today, and I didn't really know how to format it, but public places, for example, the post office, everybody's using their doors and touching the handles. And for me, if a public place like a post office has a way of propping their doors open or a door open so that people don't have to contact it the handle with their hands. I think it's a real small price to pay to have to prop the door open of businesses that have a handle that you have to use to open the door. So just during business hours, you don't need to prop it open when they're closed. Huh?
Yeah, so I think those are both really excellent points. We are going to continue to try to message around our open spaces. It looks like it'll be another beautiful weekend here. So we will have some staff out monitoring and getting some additional messaging out. There was some good messaging that came out through the California Parks and Rec Society that's a little bit more visual that we're going to start to push out as well about how to safely social distance in parks. And then reiterating that, yes, playgrounds are awesome for all these reasons, but right now it's hard, but we want kids to stay off of those shared spaces. I know that there is a group in town that has been doing this sort of microbial application to door handles that some organizations that have doors that are frequently used are applying. And agree, we continue to try to get that message out around if you do have doors that can be propped open per your building codes during this period, that they should be done so. I don't know if you're looking at something more stronger than education that you want to discuss.
Well, I think that we could start with education, but somehow we have to get smart about the door handle thing. You know, maybe just a sign in the window that we could produce and pass out that says, you know, don't touch the handle with your bare hand. Something to that effect, that the, you know, be careful. A door handle is a real common spot to, you know, touch. Everybody's touching it. Petri dish. Thank you.
All right, Mayor, should we move on to the next agenda item?
Yes. The next item is item C, adopt resolution number 190-63, creating a business resiliency emergency loan program. Director Lawyer, could I have a staff report, please?
This evening, Mayor and council members, this item before you tonight is to consider adopting resolution 190-63, which would establish an emergency loan program fund for businesses that have been hit by COVID-19. Obviously, the COVID-19 impacts are unprecedented, and state and federal resources are in the process of spooling up to assist businesses, but these resources will take several weeks to months before that capital is in the hands of businesses. A group of regional economic development professionals has been meeting over the past several weeks to try and discuss solutions, and establishing this regional business resiliency emergency loan program is one of the outcomes of those discussions. Essentially what this program would do would be to put quick capital in the hands of businesses to try and make sure that they can either keep their staffing levels or make their rents or use those for existing accounts payable. And the funds would be able to be processed through streamlined processes using our existing partners like REDEC and AEDC. The resolution does a couple of things. One, it establishes $250,000 from two funds that have existing fund balances that could be used for this purpose, to the total of $250,000. It directs the city manager and the community development director to work with these regional partners to try and build a collaboration around the use of these funds. And it allows the city manager some additional authorities to modify the program as we discover what works in this changing world, and gives the flexibility to address the need as they arise. I wanted to let you know a little bit about the regional collaboration that's happened to date. So far, the North Coast SBDC has agreed to provide business counseling, and it's also a great resource for businesses in general. They're hosting a COVID-19 webpage that has resources for businesses, and I encourage folks to check that out. But they've also agreed to provide business counseling for participants in this loan program. And so they would get some real direct feedback on best use and wisest use of these funds. And that guidance would be passed on to the underwriters and baked into the loan program ultimately. In addition, as I mentioned, we're working with the Redwood Region Economic Development Corporation, or REDEC, and AADC, two SBA lenders who already have the resources to make loans, to do underwriting, to write the loan documents, and secure UCC filings. Those two entities together are bringing, if their boards approve it, somewhere between $750 and $1 million to the table to add to this loan program. In addition, we have partners like the Humboldt Area Foundation, who's considering bringing $2.5 million to the table to assist not only with businesses but with nonprofits. Headwaters Fund is considering tomorrow at its board meeting a $2 million infusion to REDEC and AADC, and to establish a loan program that would use funds that the City of Arcata and other jurisdictions would have at their disposal as loan guarantees, as loan loss reserve in the event that their loans don't get repaid. In addition, there are several cities throughout the region that are considering participating as well. Now, the reason why we're asking for the flexibility in this resolution is because this is an evolving collaboration. Each entity has different rules and regulations that they're subject to. Their money comes with different strings, and we're all working to try and make our funds as flexible as possible to address this near-term kind of gap financing that we're talking about. And so right now, that group that I just described, in our conversations, what we're talking about is one of various options, or maybe even a mix of options, going from a loan loss reserve, where that would function like the city wouldn't actually loan money out. They would just hold money in reserve. And then potentially the Headwaters Fund would make loans to city businesses, and we would make a loan loss reserve against losses that would occur on those City of Arcata businesses. That's one way to help spread the risk. It's also a way for the city to get a little bit more bang for its buck, because it's not actually lending out money on the front end there. And it protects the Headwaters Fund from some of those losses, and we would share in those losses. Another element that is being considered here, and what's really directly being asked for right now, because this is the most expeditious rollout, is a direct lending program. We're looking for authorization for the city to take this $250,000, excuse me, and loan that out in small increments to try and tide businesses over until they get those larger emergency funds from SBA and other resources. Another option that we've been discussing regionally is pooling the funding, so that we would bring our funds together. If we had $10,000 for a loan for a City of Arcata business, and the Headwaters Fund or maybe REDEC could combine their resources, and we'd make a pooled loan program, and that would really spread the risk the most. And so we're asking for a little bit of flexibility in Resolution 19063, that we start with the direct lending program and then work with these regional partners to try and craft something that is a little more robust. The guidelines around this program are pretty brief. It's a single page, attachment B. And I just wanted to walk you through the key elements of that. One is that we would require a bank referral for this program. And so if there's a business out there that has, that's bankable, that has the ability to go out and get a loan from a bank, they should do that. Our loan fund should be reserved for businesses that are struggling and don't have bankable loans. So in that case, they get a bank referral to our program. The next step would be to ensure that they were plugged in with the North Coast SBDC and getting that business counseling to really identify what is the immediate business need. I think in particular in times of stress, it's easy to make poor decisions because you're just dealing with what's in front of you. North Coast SBDC has pulled together a group of really talented business advisors, and they would be providing that business advice to these prospective borrowers. Next, and these terms were really agreed to by the entire regional collaboration so that all of our programs were streamlined. We all came at it with different approaches initially, but we settled on having one loan program that's the same across the region so that all of the businesses would know what they're dealing with and they wouldn't have to learn different loan programs, or if we pooled resources, we wouldn't have to figure out whose lending guidelines we were using. So the terms that we all agreed to as sort of the best fit for this type of program is to allow a 6-month deferral. So from the date that the borrower signs the loan documents, there would be no payments for 6 months. During that time frame, they would still be accruing 2.5% simple interest, and that 2.5% would carry forward into a more permanent loan if they were to refinance into or somehow convert into a permanent loan after that. The loan term after that period would be a fully amortized loan over a 5-year period. Again, still with that 2.5% simple interest. And given the, my estimate of the immediate need and the resources that we have to bring to bear on this at this time, I'm recommending the City of Arcata start with a loan program that would make loans up to $10,000 if we aren't participating in a pooled program. If we do participate in a pooled program, we would have to reassess and reevaluate and see if we could bring other resources to bear on those loan programs. Right now, the guidelines do say that we would be making unsecured loans, and primarily I think that was recommended by the regional group because taking the time and the energy and the money it takes to go and secure a loan, filing the documents and whatnot would slow the program down. Just today in our conversation, we agreed that perhaps taking UCC filings would be an appropriate step, recognizing that the UCC filings on stock and inventory, equipment and inventory for most of these businesses may be pretty paltry, but it's at least some security. The last couple of things that I wanted to say about the program, just make sure that you have this before your deliberations, is that the Headwaters Fund is taking this issue up tomorrow. They've really been asking that we work as that loan loss reserve. And so if we partnered with the Headwaters Fund, what I'd be looking at is kind of doubling the amount of money that we could get into the community, retaining $250,000 as this loan loss reserve fund that we could support our regional partners to spread the risk. But then to also take the $250,000 that we're asking for tonight and start making direct loans to City of Arcata businesses. So they've asked for our support in that. And then finally, one of the big questions that comes up, you may be surprised to hear, is what about cannabis businesses? Now we have hundreds of jobs that have been created in the City of Arcata, probably thousands countywide, that are around the cannabis industry, and those businesses are being hit just like every other business. Most lending programs, that are, or banks that are federally backed, can't loan to cannabis businesses. I believe that we may have a source of funds that is not tied to federal resources in the 245 fund, the former redevelopment agencies fund. Now, this is just for discussion purposes at this point. I haven't vetted this at all with our city attorney or with our city manager, and I apologize for bringing this out in a public meeting like this, but I just wanted to be able to have the discussion if you want us to not approach that, or if you want us to investigate whether or not we can make loans to cannabis businesses as well. So with that, I believe the program, the city council could make the finding that the program is exempt from CEQA for the reasons stated in the staff report, and I would ask that you'd adopt Resolution 19063, creating a direct loan program fund to a total amount of $250,000 and grant the city manager the authority to change the program to address these developing needs. Be happy to answer any questions you may have.
I will now ask questions from the council by roll call. Vice Mayor Patino?
Yeah, I don't have any questions. I just want to say yes to making this available to our cannabis business.
All right, Council Member Watson?
Couldn't hear you for some reason, Councilmember Watson.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah, I don't have any questions, and I agree with Councilmember Patino.
Councilmember Pereira?
Same here.
Right, I also support extending this to cannabis related businesses, and I think that your proposal for effectively doubling the amount by using loan guarantees rather than direct loans is an excellent idea.
I guess I just want to clarify that if people, default on their loans, that who eats that? Is it just us, or is that what's spread across different agencies?
That would really depend on the way that the loan program is structured. If we wind up pooling, for example, and having multiple loan funding sources going into one loan, then we would lose in proportional share more than likely to the loan funds that we've added to that pool. So if we lost it all, then each of us would lose that entire proportion that we put in. If we do our direct loan program, then we're the only ones who are exposed for that. And if we did the loan loss fund, we would be exposed to the extent that the other partners aren't engaged in those loans within the loans that are made within the city of Arcata. So it kind of depends on the program as it develops. We have to recognize that these are inherently risky loans. We're going to do our best to make sure that they're scaled proportionately. Somebody may come in and ask for a $10,000 loan, but through the SBDC counseling and through the underwriting that we have with our partners, that we identify a lower loan amount that would be appropriate for their particular situation. And so we'll do our best to make loans that we can recover. One additional element that's developing in the discussions that I'm having with these regional partners is that if there is some sort of relief from the SBA or some other EDA or some funding source, or if they become bankable at some point in the future, that we are the first to refinance out, and that after that 6-month period, we would have a check-in with those borrowers to take a look at their their liquidity and where they're at in terms of their financial position at that time, what their business looks like at that time, and kind of do a mini underwriting to assess whether or not they should be at that point seeking a bank loan or an SBA loan. So we're going to do the best that we can to try and minimize loss, but I do anticipate higher loss than our typical loan program.
All right, I next will have us take public comments. So could staff please read public comments that have been submitted?
Yes, Mayor, we have no public comment on this item.
Right, any final comments or questions from council, starting with Council Member Pereira?
No, but I'm actually prepared to make a motion. I will make a motion to adopt resolution number 190-63, which creates an emergency business loan fund for a rapid response to COVID-19 impacts on local businesses.
Second.
Are there any further comments from Councilmember Watson or Vice Mayor Patino?
None for me.
None from me.
And none from me. So could we have a roll call, please, on the motion?
Yes. Councilmember Watson?
Yes.
Councilmember Pereira?
Aye.
Vice Mayor Patino?
Yes.
Mayor Winkler?
Yes.
Motion passes unanimously.
Thank you.
This concludes the business portion of our meeting. Are there any final comments, starting with Council Member Watson?
No, not at this time.
Vice Mayor Patino?
No comments.
Council Member Pereira?
Thank you, everyone.
And I want to thank all of the public who have submitted comments and submitted emails of other correspondence with us, and help as we all work together. And there has never been a time that I can remember where there's been more need for us to work as a community, and many community members are doing so, and I thank them heartily for doing that. And with that, we are adjourned.